Life as a woman in medieval society was shaped by a complex combination of social hierarchy, legal structure, religious expectation, and environmental limitation. For those who often return to quiet historical examinations of everyday life, this subject offers a familiar rhythm, revealing how ordinary existence was organized within rigid frameworks that left little room for individual choice. The Middle Ages encompassed diverse regions, cultures, and centuries, yet women across medieval Europe shared certain structural realities. Their roles were defined not by personal identity, but by family position, marital status, and economic function. Legal texts, religious writings, household records, and archaeological evidence collectively illustrate how women's lives were regulated from birth to old age. Medieval society did not treat womanhood as a single experience. The lives of noblewomen, urban artisans, peasant laborers, and religious women differed significantly in daily routine, material conditions, and social expectation. Despite these differences, all were subject to systems that prioritized lineage, property continuity, and moral order over individual autonomy. Much of what is known about medieval women comes not from personal testimony, but from documents created to manage land, labor, marriage, and inheritance. These sources reveal how women were positioned within social structures rather than how they felt about them. Through this lens, daily life appears practical, repetitive, and tightly regulated, shaped by necessity rather than self-expression. This examination does not isolate exceptional figures or dramatic events. Instead, it focuses on the ordinary patterns that governed women's lives across medieval society, tracing how social status, work, law, and belief systems defined existence over the course of a lifetime. From this foundation, the structure of medieval womanhood begins to emerge, grounded in status and shaped by circumstance. In medieval society, a woman's status was not defined by individual achievement or personal aspiration, but by her position within a rigid social hierarchy that structured every aspect of life. From birth, a woman's place was determined by family rank, land ownership, urban affiliation, and marital potential, creating a framework in which mobility was rare and expectations were fixed. Medieval Europe was divided into overlapping social categories: nobility, clergy, townspeople, and peasantry, and women occupied distinct roles within each. Noblewomen were tied to dynastic continuity, property alliances, and household management, while peasant women were essential sources of agricultural labor and domestic production. Urban women, particularly in growing medieval towns, navigated a different environment, shaped by guild regulation, market access, and legal limitation. Despite these differences, status consistently governed access to resources, legal protection, and physical security. For noblewomen, status brought material comfort but limited autonomy. Their value lay in inheritance, marriage alliances, and the production of legitimate heirs. Estate records and marriage contracts reveal how carefully noble daughters were positioned within social networks, often betrothed at a young age to strengthen political or economic ties. While noblewomen could oversee households and estates in their husband's absence, their authority was conditional and derived rather than independent. Peasant women experienced status in a more physically demanding form. Bound to land through manorial systems, their labor supported both household survival and feudal obligation. Manorial roles document women working fields, tending animals, producing textiles, and managing food preservation, especially during periods when male labor was absent or redirected. Their status offered little protection against hardship, and legal recourse was limited, yet their economic contribution was indispensable. Urban women occupied a more ambiguous position. In some cities, widows could inherit workshops, manage businesses, or participate indirectly in guild production. However, legal restrictions often prevented women from full guild membership, limiting their authority and earnings. Town charters and court records show how female status fluctuated depending on marital condition, Unmarried daughters, wives, and widows each occupied distinct legal categories with differing rights and obligations. Across all classes, female status was relational rather than individual. A woman was defined as a daughter, wife, widow, or servant, and her social identity shifted as these relationships changed. Legal texts rarely addressed women as autonomous actors, instead situating them within male-headed households or institutional structures. This relational status, birth, marked the first moment at which a woman's life in medieval society became subject to social expectation, religious interpretation, and legal concern. Childbirth was not understood solely as a biological event, but as a moment of risk, transition, and communal significance, shaped by beliefs about the body, morality, and divine will. For medieval women, birth carried implications that extended far beyond infancy, influencing status, family structure, and survival itself. High infant mortality defined medieval childbirth across all social classes. Medical knowledge was limited, sanitation inconsistent, and complications common. Written sources, including medical treatises and church records, indicate that both mother and child faced significant danger during labor. As a result, childbirth was surrounded by ritual practices intended to protect against misfortune, invoking saints, prayers, and symbolic actions believed to influence outcomes beyond human control. The experience of birth varied according to social status. Noblewomen typically gave birth within private chambers, assisted by midwives and female attendants drawn from the household. These spaces were prepared in advance, warmed with fires and hung with textiles to create controlled environments. Despite these precautions, noble births remained hazardous, and the pressure to produce male heirs intensified both physical and emotional strain. Failure to survive childbirth could disrupt dynastic continuity, underscoring the political significance of a woman's reproductive role. Peasant women experienced childbirth under far more constrained conditions. Birth often occurred within shared living spaces, with limited assistance and few resources. Midwives in rural communities relied on traditional knowledge passed orally rather than written instruction. Archaeological evidence from rural dwellings suggests that women returned to labor shortly after birth, particularly during agricultural seasons, reflecting the economic necessity that shaped maternal experience. Urban women occupied an intermediate position. In towns, regulated midwifery practices emerged in some regions, with city authorities overseeing training and conduct. Court records document disputes involving midwives, accusations of negligence, and legal interventions following difficult births. These sources reveal how childbirth became subject to institutional oversight, particularly when outcomes affected inheritance, legitimacy, or moral order. Religious belief played a central role in shaping attitudes toward birth. Childbirth was associated with both creation and danger, reflecting theological views on the female body as simultaneously necessary and vulnerable to disorder. Baptism was often performed immediately after birth if survival seemed uncertain, underscoring fears surrounding infant mortality and spiritual risk. For women, successful childbirth reinforced social value, while repeated loss could result in stigma or diminished standing within the household. Legal considerations also intersected with birth. Laws governing legitimacy determined a child's right to inheritance and social recognition, placing women under scrutiny regarding marital status and sexual conduct. Accusations of impropriety could follow irregular births, and women bore the burden of defending their reputation and their children's future. These legal pressures transformed childbirth into a moment of public consequence rather than private experience. Birth thus represented the earliest intersection between female biology and medieval social structure. From the moment a child entered the world, a woman's role as mother became embedded within systems of law, belief, and labor. This foundation shaped the expectations placed upon her throughout life, as childhood, family obligation, and work followed in structured succession. Childhood for girls in medieval society unfolded within carefully defined social expectations that differed sharply from those placed on boys. From an early age, girls were prepared for lives structured around domestic responsibility, obedience, and future marriage, with education and daily activity shaped by class, geography, and household need rather than individual inclination. Medieval sources rarely describe childhood as a protected or transitional phase. Instead, it was treated as early preparation for adult roles. In noble households, girls grew up within enclosed domestic environments under the supervision of female relatives, nurses, and tutors. Their early years were shaped by instruction in proper behavior, religious observance, and household etiquette. Written household manuals and letters suggest that noble girls learned to read devotional texts, manage servants, and understand lineage and inheritance, even if they rarely exercised direct authority. Childhood education emphasized moral discipline and social awareness rather than intellectual independence. For peasant girls, childhood was closely tied to labor. From a young age, girls assisted with household tasks such as caring for younger siblings, collecting water, preparing food, and tending animals. Manorial records and agricultural accounts indicate that girls' labor contributed significantly to household survival, particularly during periods of seasonal strain. Childhood in rural communities was short, defined less by age than by physical capability and economic necessity. Urban childhood presented a different pattern. In towns, girls were exposed to craft production, market activity, and household trades. Some learned skills associated with family workshops, including textile work, food preparation, or small-scale commerce. While guild membership remained restricted, urban girls often acquired practical knowledge that allowed limited economic participation later in life. City ordinances regulating apprenticeships and domestic service reveal how childhood became increasingly formalized within urban legal structures. Religious instruction formed a central element of childhood across all classes. Girls were taught prayers, moral lessons, and ritual observance from an early age, reinforcing expectations of modesty, obedience, and piety. Church sermons and devotional texts frequently addressed young girls as future wives or religious women, framing childhood as a preparatory stage for adult submission rather than self-discovery. This moral education shaped behavior long before legal adulthood. Health and survival remained uncertain throughout childhood. High mortality rates meant that many girls did not reach adolescence, and those who did often experienced illness, malnutrition, or injury. Archaeological evidence from burial sites shows signs of physical stress in young female remains, reflecting the cumulative impact of labor, diet, and disease. Childhood vulnerability influenced family strategies, encouraging early labor participation and close supervision. Legal recognition of childhood was limited. Girls were rarely treated as independent legal subjects, instead existing under the authority of fathers, guardians, or institutions. Their rights and obligations were mediated through family structures, reinforcing dependency as a defining feature of early life. Childhood thus functioned as an early stage of social conditioning. Through labor, instruction, and moral expectation, girls were guided toward predetermined roles within medieval society. These formative experiences shaped their transition into family life, work, and marriage, embedding social norms long before adulthood began.
Family life formed the central framework through which women experienced obligation, authority, and identity. The household was not simply a private space, but a social and economic unit governed by custom, law, and religious expectation. For women, family defined daily labor, legal status, and long-term security, shaping life from adolescence through old age. In medieval Europe, the household functioned as a unit of production rather than consumption. Women's roles within the family were closely tied to sustaining the structure through food preparation, textile production, childcare, and the management of domestic resources. Estate records and household accounts consistently reference women's labor as essential to stability, even when it remained legally invisible. The family relied on female work not as assistance, but as a foundational element of survival. Authority within the family was typically hierarchical. Male household heads exercised legal and economic control, while women operated within defined spheres of responsibility. In noble families, women managed servants, supervised storage, and oversaw domestic order, particularly in their husband's absence. These responsibilities granted practical influence, yet authority remained conditional, derived from marital or familial position rather than personal right. Among peasant families, women's roles were more physically demanding and less differentiated. Daily life required constant coordination between agricultural labor and domestic tasks. Women worked fields, cared for livestock, preserved food, and maintained household routines alongside men, especially during periods of labor shortage. Manorial documents reveal how family survival depended on flexible labor roles, though legal recognition of women's contributions remained limited. Family relationships were shaped by economic necessity as much as emotional connection. Marriage alliances, dowries, and inheritance arrangements structured kinship networks, influencing where women lived and whom they depended upon. Widows occupied a distinct position within family structures, sometimes gaining increased autonomy through control of property or workshops, though this autonomy was often temporary and subject to male guardianship. Religious expectation reinforced family hierarchy. Church teachings emphasized obedience, chastity, and maternal duty, framing women's family roles as moral obligations rather than social constructs. Sermons and conduct literature portrayed ideal womanhood as inseparable from devotion to family, reinforcing norms that limited deviation from prescribed roles. These teachings shaped behavior within the household as much as legal authority did. Conflict within families occasionally surfaced in legal records. Disputes over dowries, inheritance, or domestic violence reveal the tensions inherent in hierarchical family structures. Courts often prioritized preserving household stability over addressing individual suffering, reflecting broader social values that placed continuity above personal welfare. Family life therefore functioned as both a source of security and a site of limitation. It provided structure, identity, and material support, while simultaneously reinforcing dependency and inequality. Through family, women's lives were organized, regulated, and sustained, forming the foundation upon which work, law, and marriage would further shape experience in medieval society.
Work defined much of a woman's daily existence in medieval society, shaping not only how time was spent, but how value, duty, and survival were understood. Female labor was constant, varied, and essential, yet rarely acknowledged as formal work within legal or economic records. Instead, it was absorbed into the structure of household obligation, blurring the boundary between domestic responsibility and productive labor. In rural communities, women's work was inseparable from agricultural life. They participated in planting, harvesting, animal care, and food preservation, often working alongside men during peak seasons. Manorial roles document women brewing ale, producing cheese, spinning wool, and maintaining household supplies, activities that generated income or fulfilled feudal obligations. Despite their economic importance, these tasks were rarely classified as skilled labor, reinforcing gendered distinctions in recognition rather than effort. Urban environments offered different forms of work. In medieval towns, women contributed to craft production, market exchange, and domestic service. Many worked within family workshops, assisting in trades such as textile production, baking, brewing, and small-scale commerce. While guild membership was generally restricted, women's labor supported guild economies indirectly, and widows sometimes managed workshops in their own right. City court records reflect both opportunity and limitation, showing women active in economic life yet constrained by legal boundaries. Domestic service formed another major area of female employment. Young women often entered service in noble or urban households, performing tasks ranging from childcare and food preparation to cleaning and textile maintenance. These positions provided food and shelter but offered little security. Service contracts, where they exist, emphasize obedience and moral conduct over skill or compensation, highlighting the unequal power relations embedded in such work. Religious institutions also structured women's labor. Convents and charitable houses offered alternative forms of work centered on prayer, education, and care. For some women, religious life provided stability and limited autonomy unavailable elsewhere. Yet, even within these institutions, labor was regulated by hierarchy and discipline, reflecting broader societal norms rather than escape from them. Workload intensified during periods of crisis. Famine, war, and disease increased demands on women's labor as households struggled to adapt. Archaeological evidence of wear on tools and skeletal remains suggests prolonged physical strain, particularly among lower status women. These conditions reveal how work functioned not as a choice, but as an unavoidable response to environmental and social pressure. Legal frameworks rarely protected women's labor. Wages, when paid, were lower than those of men, and disputes were often resolved in favor of employers or male relatives. Despite this, women continued to work across multiple domains, sustaining households and communities through persistence rather than recognition. Work thus shaped women's lives as a continuous process rather than a distinct activity. It structured days, defined value, and reinforced social position. From this foundation of labor, other aspects of medieval womanhood, law, marriage, and health emerged, further regulating how work translated into survival and social standing. Law shaped the lives of women in medieval society through a complex system of rights, restrictions, and dependencies that varied by region, class, and marital status. Rather than addressing women as autonomous legal subjects, medieval legal systems positioned them within family structures, guild regulations, and religious authority, defining their legal identity in relation to others. As a result, women's interaction with the law was indirect, conditional, and often limited. In most regions of medieval Europe, women were legally represented by male guardians, fathers, husbands, or other relatives. This guardianship influenced nearly every legal action, from property transactions to court appearances. Legal codes and customary law frequently required male consent for contracts, inheritance claims, or legal testimony, reinforcing dependency as a legal norm rather than an exception. These structures were justified as protective, though they often restricted women's ability to act independently. Property law illustrates this limitation clearly. While women could inherit land or movable goods in certain circumstances, especially as widows, their control over these assets was often temporary or conditional. Marriage contracts and dowry arrangements transferred property management to husbands, and legal disputes over land frequently sidelined women's claims in favor of male kin. Court records reveal how women navigated these systems through negotiation rather than direct legal authority. Criminal law treated women differently depending on status and circumstance. Penalties for similar offenses could vary according to gender, marital condition, and perceived moral responsibility. In cases involving sexuality, reputation, or domestic conflict, women were often judged more harshly as legal systems prioritized social order and moral conformity. Testimony from women could be discounted or subjected to additional scrutiny, reflecting broader assumptions about credibility and authority. Urban law offered limited variation. In some towns, women, particularly widows, could appear in court, manage businesses, or enter contracts. City charters and legal records document women acting as litigants or witnesses, though usually within narrowly defined roles. These exceptions highlight how law adapted to economic necessity while maintaining underlying gender hierarchies. Church law further shaped women's legal experience. Canon law regulated marriage, inheritance, and moral conduct, often overlapping with secular courts. Ecclesiastical proceedings involving women addressed issues such as marital disputes, sexual behavior, and religious obligation, reinforcing ideals of obedience and chastity. These courts wielded significant influence, shaping outcomes that affected women's social standing and personal security. The legal framework governing medieval women thus combined protection with restriction. While law offered structure and occasional recourse, it consistently limited autonomy by embedding women within systems of male authority. Understanding this legal environment is essential to understanding how women navigated marriage, health, and religious life under conditions shaped as much by regulation as by custom. Marriage represented one of the most defining transitions in a woman's life in medieval society, shaping legal identity, economic security, and social expectation. Rather than a private or romantic union, marriage functioned as a regulated institution designed to manage property, lineage, labor, and moral order. For women across all social classes, marriage structured daily life and determined long-term dependence within established hierarchies. In noble families, marriage served primarily as a strategic alliance. Contracts negotiated between families outlined dowries, inheritance arrangements, and obligations long before the individuals involved reached adulthood. Noblewomen were often betrothed at a young age, with personal preference carrying little weight in the process. Their marriages linked estates, secured political loyalty, and reinforced dynastic continuity, making individual well-being secondary to family interest. In peasant communities, marriage was closely tied to economic survival. The formation of a household required access to land, tools, and labor, and marriage provided a framework for sharing these resources. Manorial records indicate that marriages were often delayed until couples could support themselves, particularly in regions with limited land availability. For women, marriage meant integration into a household's husband, where authority and labor expectations were already established. City court records show how marriage shaped women's access to work and legal recognition. Church doctrine deeply influenced marital norms. Canon law emphasized consent, indissolubility, and sexual regulation, framing marriage as both a sacrament and a moral obligation. While this doctrine theoretically granted women the right to consent, social pressure and family authority often constrained meaningful choice. Ecclesiastical courts handled disputes involving marriage validity, separation, and marital duty, reinforcing religious oversight of private life. Marriage altered a woman's legal status significantly. Upon marriage, many women lost independent control over property and entered into legal dependence under their husbands. Responsibilities expanded to include household management, childbearing, and obedience, while avenues for recourse narrowed. Legal protection against mistreatment existed in theory but was unevenly enforced, leaving many women reliant on kinship networks rather than institutions. The experience of marriage varied widely, shaped by class, region, and circumstance, yet across medieval society it functioned as a central mechanism through which women's lives were organized, regulated, and constrained. From marriage flowed expectations surrounding health, reproduction, religious conduct, and endurance, forming the foundation upon which later stages of life unfolded. Health in medieval society was understood through a combination of medical theory, religious belief, and practical experience, shaping how women's bodies were treated, interpreted, and managed across the life cycle. Illness was rarely viewed as a purely physical condition. Instead, it was often associated with imbalance, moral weakness, or divine influence. For women, whose bodies were already perceived as more vulnerable and unpredictable, health carried particular social and symbolic weight. Medieval medical knowledge relied heavily on classical authorities such as Galen and Hippocrates, whose theories emphasized bodily humors and balance. Women were believed to possess colder and wetter constitutions, a view that influenced diagnosis and treatment. Medical texts frequently linked female illness to reproductive functions, reinforcing the idea that women's health was inseparable from menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. These assumptions shaped care practices and justified limited intervention rather than prevention. Access to medical treatment varied significantly by class. Noblewomen could consult trained physicians or surgeons, though treatments remained rudimentary and outcomes uncertain. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, and dietary adjustments formed the core of medical response. Household accounts occasionally reference payments to healers or the acquisition of medicinal ingredients, reflecting attempts to manage health within elite domestic settings. Peasant women relied primarily on traditional knowledge and local practitioners. Midwives, herbalists, and community healers provided care using remedies passed through oral tradition. Archaeological evidence of plant remains and tools associated with healing suggests that women played a central role in managing everyday health concerns. Despite this, such knowledge existed outside formal medical authority and was often undervalued or later criminalized. Urban environments introduced additional health challenges. Crowded living conditions, limited sanitation, and frequent outbreaks of disease increased vulnerability. Women working in domestic service or craft production faced repetitive strain, exposure to smoke, and poor nutrition. Skeletal remains from medieval urban cemeteries show signs of chronic stress, joint wear, and nutritional deficiency, indicating long-term health impacts of labor and environment. Religious belief shaped responses to illness. Prayer, pilgrimage, and ritual healing complemented medical treatment, especially when conditions persisted or worsened. Women were encouraged to endure suffering with patience, interpreting illness as a test of faith or moral character. This framing often discouraged active intervention and reinforced acceptance rather than recovery. Health risks accumulated over time. Repeated pregnancies, heavy labor, and inadequate nutrition weakened bodies, particularly among lower status women. Old age brought increased dependence and reduced capacity for work, leaving many women vulnerable within households structured around productivity. Care in later life depended largely on family support rather than institutional provision. Health in medieval society thus reflected broader structures of inequality. Women's bodies were shaped by belief, labor, and limited care, revealing how physical well-being was managed within systems that prioritized continuity and order over individual welfare. From this context of vulnerability, religious life and daily routine further influenced how women navigated endurance and survival.
Religion formed one of the most influential frameworks through which women's lives in medieval society were understood, regulated, and given meaning. Religious belief did not exist as a separate sphere, but permeated daily routine, moral expectation, and social judgment, shaping how women were taught to behave, endure hardship, and interpret their place in the world. For many women, religious life offered both structure and limitation, reinforcing obedience while providing limited forms of stability. Christian doctrine emphasized humility, chastity, and submission as core virtues for women. Sermons, devotional texts, and conduct literature repeatedly framed ideal womanhood through models of saints, virgins, wives, and mothers. These models were not abstract ideals, but practical guides that shaped behavior within households and communities. Religious instruction reinforced acceptance of suffering, encouraging women to view labor, illness, and obedience as spiritually meaningful rather than socially imposed. Participation in religious practice varied by class and circumstance. Noblewomen often engaged in private devotion, patronage of religious institutions, and supervision of household worship. Their piety enhanced family prestige and reinforced moral authority within the domestic sphere. Peasant women participated in parish life through attendance at Mass, observance of feast days, and involvement in communal rituals that structured the agricultural calendar. These practices provided rhythm and predictability in lives shaped by labor and uncertainty. Convents in religious houses offered an alternative path for some women. Life within religious institutions provided education, stability, and limited autonomy unavailable in secular society. Nuns engaged in prayer, teaching, manuscript production, and charitable work, contributing to intellectual and spiritual life. However, access to convents was often restricted by class, dowry requirements, and family approval, limiting this option to a small minority. Religious authority also exercised control over women's behavior. Confession, penance, and moral surveillance shaped daily conduct, particularly regarding sexuality and marital duty. Church courts addressed disputes involving marriage, adultery, and moral transgression, reinforcing religious norms through legal consequence. Women's reputations were closely tied to perceptions of piety, and deviation could result in social exclusion or legal sanction. Belief in divine intervention influenced responses to misfortune. Illness, infertility, and loss were often interpreted as spiritual trials rather than material conditions. Women were encouraged to seek meaning through prayer, pilgrimage, and acceptance, reinforcing endurance over resistance.
This framework provided comfort, but also discouraged questioning of structural inequality. Religion thus functioned as both support and constraint. It offered moral explanation and communal belonging while reinforcing hierarchical roles and expectations. Through religious life, women navigated a world in which faith shaped not only belief, but daily experience, identity, and survival in medieval society. Daily life for women in medieval society was structured around repetition, routine, and responsibility, shaped by seasonal rhythms, household demands, and social expectation. Rather than being defined by singular events, women's lives unfolded through continuous cycles of work, care, and obligation that left little space for deviation. These daily patterns formed the practical reality of medieval womanhood, often invisible in grand historical narratives, yet essential to social continuity. The rhythm of the day was dictated by light, labor, and necessity. Rising early, women prepared food, tended fires, and organized domestic tasks before agricultural or craft work began. In rural households, mornings involved animal care, water collection, and preparation for field labor, while urban women balanced household duties with market activity or workshop assistance. These routines repeated with minor variation, reinforcing predictability as a survival strategy. Domestic space shaped daily movement. Women spent much of their time within or near the household, navigating kitchens, storage rooms, yards, and nearby fields. Archaeological studies of medieval dwellings reveal how space was organized around female labor, with hearths, looms, and storage areas positioned for constant use. The material environment both enabled and constrained daily activity, shaping how work was performed and how time was perceived. Seasonal change altered daily routine without disrupting its underlying structure. Winter intensified indoor labor, focusing on textile work, food preservation, and maintenance, while summer expanded outdoor responsibilities. Feast days and religious observances punctuated the calendar, offering brief interruption rather than sustained rest. These moments provided rhythm and social cohesion, reinforcing communal identity rather than individual leisure. Social interaction occurred primarily within these routines. Women exchanged information, assistance, and resources during shared tasks such as baking, washing, or market attendance. These interactions formed informal support networks that helped manage risk, illness, and scarcity. Though rarely documented in written sources, such networks are suggested by material evidence and recurring patterns of communal labor. Silence and endurance characterized much of daily life. Medieval sources rarely record women's voices directly, instead capturing their presence through labor records, household accounts, and legal references. This absence reflects not inactivity, but normalization. Daily work was expected, unremarkable, and therefore undocumented. The continuity of routine masked the physical and emotional demands placed upon women. Daily life also reinforced social hierarchy. Differences in clothing, diet, and living conditions were experienced not abstractly, but through everyday practice. The contrast between noble comfort and peasant necessity was embedded in routine, shaping perception of status through constant comparison. For women, daily life functioned as both expression and reinforcement of social position. Through these repeated actions, women sustained households, communities, and economic systems. Daily life did not offer transformation, but continuity. It formed the foundation upon which endurance was built, preparing women to navigate hardship, uncertainty, and obligation within a society structured around persistence rather than change. Survival for women in medieval society depended less on individual agency than on adaptation to systems that offered limited flexibility. Endurance was framed as resistance, but as compliance, shaped by experience, routine, and communal knowledge. Within a world defined by hierarchy, scarcity, and obligation, women survived by learning how to function effectively inside existing constraints rather than attempting to escape them. Adaptation began with practical knowledge passed across generations. Skills related to food preservation, textile production, childcare, and health management were transmitted informally, forming a foundation of resilience within households and communities. This knowledge was rarely written down, yet it sustained daily life under conditions of uncertainty, illness, and environmental pressure. Survival was collective rather than individual, rooted in shared experience rather than formal instruction. Social networks played a crucial role. Women relied on kinship ties, neighbors, and informal cooperation to manage childbirth, illness, and labor demands. Assistance was exchanged through routine interaction rather than institutional support, reinforcing dependence on communal stability. These networks functioned quietly, without recognition, yet provided essential support in moments of crisis. Economic survival required constant labor. Women adjusted workloads according to season, household need, and physical capacity, prioritizing tasks that ensured immediate continuity. Archaeological evidence of long-term physical strain suggests that endurance came at a cost, particularly for lower-status women whose labor demands were greatest. Survival was achieved through persistence rather than protection. Religious belief offered an interpretive framework for endurance. Faith provided meaning in suffering and uncertainty, encouraging acceptance rather than confrontation. This perspective reinforced social stability while offering psychological support in the absence of material security. For many women, belief functioned as a means of coping with conditions beyond personal control. Old age highlighted the limits of survival strategies. As physical capacity declined, women became increasingly dependent on family or community support. Widows without resources faced vulnerability, relying on charity or continued labor to maintain security. These outcomes reveal how survival remained conditional throughout life, shaped by relationships and circumstance rather than guaranteed by rights. Survival in medieval society was therefore not a single achievement, but a continuous process. Women endured through repetition, adaptation, and integration into systems that valued continuity over change. Their lives reveal how societies persist, not through dramatic transformation, but through sustained effort carried quietly across generations.